What's up, guys? It's Hunter Sitchy from CheckShovPoker.com, and the title of today's video is Empty the Clip. So, like I've said in previous videos, I like to record any interesting hands that I play at the table, and each month I'll take a look at all of them and see if I can find a recurring pattern, like firing three streets or check raising. And then I'll take all those hands, throw them in a replayer, and give you my thoughts on them. So this month I found myself in an abnormally high number of good bluffing situations, and that's basically why I decided to do this video. So now, as a word of caution, please don't think I'm doing stuff like this every hand. These are just a few specific situations that have come up in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So don't start changing your game and just trying to, fire every street that you can. These are all very calculated situations, and it's important that you realize that. So with that being said, let's just jump into some of these hand histories here. So in this first hand, it folds to me in the hijack, and I open to 35 with Queen 10 of diamonds. Now, the reason I'm opening to 35 is because 510 is played with green chips where I'm at, and I have a theory that a fish in the big blind is more likely to give you action if he only has to throw one chip into the pot. Thus, I'm opening to 35. Now, another thing you might notice is that Queen 10 suited is a little bit loose for that raise size. If I was opening to 2.5x, that would be a totally standard open with Queen 10 suited from the hijack. Since I'm opening a little bit bigger, I need to be more cognizant of what the cutoff and button are going to do. And since I'm giving you kind of a full analysis of this hand history, the cutoff is a nit and the button is a guy that isn't going to 3-bet me enough, and he isn't going to put me in very many tough situations. And of course, the big blind is a fish. So the cutoff folds, the button flats, and I'm going to show you what his range looks like in Flopzilla here in just a second. And then the small blind and big blind fold and get out of our way, so we go heads up to a flop of King of Diamonds, 8 of Clubs, 6 of Clubs. So before the flop is even dealt, I'm already contemplating what the button is going to flop me with, and like I said, I don't think he's 3-betting me enough that it's going to prevent me from being able to profitably open Queen 10 suited from the hijack, especially when there's a fish in the big blind. So I think his range looks something like this. I think he's going to be flatting with any small pocket pair, and I think it's going to go up into middling pocket pairs all the way up to about tens. I also think he's going to be flatting me with a variety of suited connectors and perhaps suited gappers. I think 6-4 suited to Jack 9 suited is pretty reasonable. And it's going to go into these broadways that he won't feel comfortable 3-betting with. So I think it might look something like this. And I don't know how often he's flatting these broadways. I would assume that he's going to be flatting with the majority of these, since I haven't seen him 3-bet with them. And overall, I think his range looks something like this. Now, he might occasionally take a hand like 6-4 suited and 3-bet it, but I think overall it's only going to be like 10% of the time that he's dealt 6-4 suited. He might occasionally take a hand like King 10 suited and 3-bet it, but again, I don't think it's more than like 10% of the time that he's dealt that, and it's so rare that I don't feel like it's worth really weighting any of that out using the weight feature over here. So if I just do a full analysis here and I throw my hand into the dead cards, I have Queen 10 of diamonds, and then I go ahead and go over to the flop and punch this range in. So King of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 6 of clubs. Right away I can see how often he's connecting with this board here. So I think what I really should do is just look at how often he's smashing this board here. So I can get a better idea of whose range is, whose range has an advantage on this board here. And I think you're going to see that it's, this is a pretty neutral board, even though you might think that the guy in position has a slightly stronger range. And the reason for that is the top card is a king, and he's 3-betting ace-king the vast majority of the time, so that caps his range a little bit. while my range remains uncapped, I can still have aces, I can have top set, and I can have ace king. So if we go in here, again, it's very rare to flop a set. You've got, you know, 2 sets in his range, and he can flop those 3% of the time. I think he's going to be raising with those the majority of the time on the flop. Then you can go in and look at flush draws. He's going to flop a flush draw 9% of the time. Open enders, same thing. And then Flopzilla also gives you the ability to combine a flush draw and a straight draw, or a flush draw and a pair. Again, those are obviously very rare, so 1% of the time, 2% of the time for a flush draw and a pair. And overall, I think he's going to be raising with those very close to 100% of the time, because it's not very hard for him to balance a raising range here. He has 8s, he has 6s, he has 8-6, so there's enough value in his range that it can support a variety of semi-bluffs, especially since they have huge equity against my hand. So I think he's going to take all of those and raise with them, especially since I've played with him quite a bit. Now, what does that mean for me? Well, it definitely benefits my barreling ranges when he takes his range and contorts it like that, because if he doesn't raise me on the flop, his calling range is severely capped, and it allows me to fire 3 streets on a variety of runouts. So another thing to consider is that if I had to pick hands to continue firing with on the flop here, of course I'm going to be value betting with the majority of my kings, probably all of them, just because there are so many middling pairs in his range and weak pairs that I feel like he has to peel one just to prevent me from making an instant profit with my flop barrel. And then I'm also going to be firing, of course, with aces, top set, middle set, bottom set, and I might have 8-6 in my range depending on who's in the cutoff and who's on the button. Then of course I have flush draws, and I might also have 9-7 suited and 10-9 suited in my range. And then as I work my way down, what other hands would I like to continue firing with? It's going to then go to hands that have a backdoor flush draw. Queen 10 of diamonds is a candidate. Queen 10 is actually an awesome hand because it also gives me backdoor straight draw opportunities. So if an ace, a jack, a 9, or a 7 comes off, I also pick up a gut shot. Now, when I'm putting my turn barreling range together, I like to kind of glance over here to the hotness scale while I'm still on the flop, so I can kind of figure out, on average how many barrels I'm going to fire with this hand. And Flopzilla is awesome. They added this feature here, so it kind of weights the value of your hand. So obviously I pick up a significant amount of equity if I make a pair. So queens and 10s pick up a significant amount of equity against this range, not his calling range. So if his calling range was super tight and he was only calling me with a king plus, obviously I wouldn't gain any equity. But against his overall range over here, I'm picking up a decent amount of equity if I make a pair. And that's why these are highlighted in a darker purple or darker blue. And then of course I also pick up a little bit of equity in terms of gut shots if an ace comes off, a jack comes off, a 9, and a 7 comes off. And then if you look at diamonds, so diamonds are right here. These all light up in a very dark blue, and that's because I'm picking up over 20% equity whenever a diamond comes off. So I'm certainly going to be barreling on those unless the turn card gives my opponent's flatting and continuance range some kind of huge range advantage. But overall, I'm pretty much always going to be firing if a diamond comes off. So right away, I just went into Flopzilla, and since I've done this 10,000 times, I can pretty much already visualize this in my head, and I already have the majority of this figured out before the flop is even dealt. And then once I see the flop, I know how I'm going to arrange my barreling range against what I think his flatting range is, and that's kind of how I'm going to continue with the hand. So I throw out my standard c-bet of 50 and he calls. This call caps his range here, so remember that it's very hard for him to have an ace-high flush draw when he just flats my c-bet here. So the turn is the deuce of clubs, and this card actually benefits my range more than his range because he's raising the majority of his club draws on the flop. So my range is pretty much uncapped here. His range is a little bit more capped, and if I had to pick a hand to continue firing with, it would obviously be a hand that has one club in it, and then it would be hands that missed backdoor flush draws. Queen 10 of diamonds is one of those candidates, so you follow through with that. I fire another barrel for 125. He flats again, so at this point it's very likely that he has a king, and some of those kings are going to have clubs in them, and I'm just going to have to deal with that. So then the three of clubs comes off, and this is a card where I don't see people fire the third barrel very often, but if you go back and rewind the video and look at his range on the flop and the range that I think he's going to call me with, you realize that really the only way he can have the ace of clubs in his range here is if he floated me with a hand like ace queen or ace jack with one club in it, and I just think that the percentage of time that he's going to do that is so small in comparison to the percentage of time that he has a king that I really just have to fire a third barrel here, because if I think the majority of his range on the turn adds up to a king, only less than half of those combos have a club in them, and I only need to get him to fold like a third of the time if I fire a third barrel here, and he's folding, like, if I had to estimate off the top of my head, I think he's folding about 80% of the time. So I throw out 225, and obviously you can't see what he showed me while we were playing, but he just shows me the king of hearts and folds, and I just muck my hand. Nobody ever sees what happens, but ultimately my non-showdown winnings go way up here when I see what's wrong with his range and then attack that, and nobody ever even notices it unless I put it in a video like this. So that's kind of the power of Flopzilla, understanding your pot equity, understanding fold equity, and understanding board texture. So this next hand is pretty much a combination of all of the reasons why you shouldn't open limp pre-flop and hold them. So EP1 calls 10. I'm going to show you what his range looks like here in just a second. It folds to me in the cutoff, and I have 8-6 suited, and I ISO to 50. And obviously before I did this, I looked to my left. The button is the same guy to my left in the last hand, and he's just playing way too tight, and he's not going to interfere with what I'm doing even if he knows that I'm opening too wide. And the small blind and big blind really aren't ever going to get in my way either. And then it goes back to EP1 who limp calls here. So now I want to go over to Flopzilla and show you what his range looks like. So this limper is the kind of guy that's actually going to raise it if he has something big pre-flop. So I think his opening range looks something like 9s plus all the way up to aces. And then I think it's ace jack plus and probably king queen. He doesn't really have much of a limp raising game, which is great for me, so I don't really ever have to worry about that when I see him open limp. Now, obviously, his open limping range is just the rest of his range that he's going to continue with. So I feel like that's deuces plus up into about 8s. It's going to include suited connectors and suited gappers. And then I also think it's going to go into all these broadways here that he doesn't feel comfortable opening with. So stuff like this, all the way into kind of the king jack region. It's probably also going to include suited aces, and then the point where his range really starts to fall apart is when he starts adding all these offsuit broadways, because these just add like a million combos to his range, and it's just like impossible for him to balance this out. So this is what I feel like his open limping range is. He's going to continue with all of this when I ISO to 50. And now I'm just going to show you how I pick apart a range like this. So I ISO, he limp calls, and the flop comes Queen of Diamonds, 7 of Spades, 5 of Clubs, he checks to me. So obviously if I had to construct a range here for c-betting, I would include the top end of my range. So I have pocket 5s, 7s, and queens in my range. I'm going to c-bet with all of those. Next I'm going to include aces, kings, ace, queen, king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10, queen 9 suited, queen 8 suited. And then obviously if I need to add bluffs to my range, I would include open enders. 8-6 is one of those. I might also have 6-4 suited. And then I would go and move on to gut shots. So I would have 9-8 suited here in my range. And perhaps 4-3 suited. And then if I needed to continue adding to my range, I would add hands that have backdoor flush draws. So 8-6 is probably the best bluffing hand that I have in my range here, so that's pretty much always going to be included in the range of hands that I continue firing with here. So that doesn't take much explanation. What does take some explanation is why I decided to fire 3 barrels here, and I would like to make you notice that my opponent's range is pretty much capped at a set of 7s here, and there are only 3 combinations of those, and then next he has a set of 5s. There are 3 combinations of those, and lastly 7-5 suited could be included in his range, but there are only 2 combinations of those since there's a 7 of spades and a 5 of clubs on the board. So what does that mean for me? He's dealing with a very limited number of strong hands here, so he's not really ever going to be check raising me because he has no incentive to check raise me. And that's a big reason why he shouldn't be limping with small pocket pairs in this situation, is because he can't even check raise and get value because he just doesn't have any incentive to check raise bluff me here. It's just really hard for him to balance that out. Like, he would have to do something like take 8-6 suited and just decide to fire 3 streets with it by check raising barrel, and then balance that out by having sets and bottom 2 some of the time. And that just isn't really a great way for him to construct his range. He's just way better off folding those and just opening the top half of his range there under the gun. So I fire and he check calls. His range is super capped here, and the turn is the 10 of hearts. He checks. This doesn't look like a great card for me. It's actually an awesome card because it weakens his range a bunch. So it actually makes it less likely that he has a strong top pair here. So like I said, the best top pair he can have is Queen Jack, and then the next best hand that he can have is Queen 10, and the 10 actually makes it 25% less likely that he has that hand because he had 12 combinations of Queen 10 on the flop. Now the 10 comes off, he has 9 combinations, albeit they improve to 2 pair, but it makes it less likely that he has a hand that he can calm me down with. So again, if I had to construct a barreling range here, I would include all of my open enders, and I would also include hands that picked up open enders. So I would include 9-8 suited and King Jack suited and Jack 9 suited that I fired with on the flop, and then of course all of the top end hands in my range that I'm value betting. So again, 5s, 7s, queens, 10s might be in there, Queen 10, aces, kings, ace, queen, king, queen, and probably Queen Jack. So I fire again, he calls, and the river is a 5. 5 is an awesome card for my range because he never has a 5 in his range at this point in the hand, and then it improves aces and kings to a better 2 pair, so Queen 10 is significantly devalued for him. And now, like I said, his range is capped at Queen Jack. My range is still completely uncapped. And although I'm against using multiple bet sizes on the river because against good players it's going to give them extra information on the range of hands that I'm firing with. So if I bet 400 here with, let's say, 80% of my range, and it has a decent balance between hands that I can value bet with and hands that I can bluff with, and then I take the other 20% of my range and I fire like 1200 at this pot with it. Well, now he has extra information because he realizes that I'm polarizing my range, and I'm gonna have to be firing a big barrel with a much stronger hand, like a set of tens if I even have that in my range, and then a set of sevens and 7-5 suited, and then the rest of the time I'm going to be firing with the best bluffs in my range, so all of the hands that don't block hands in under the guns range that I'm trying to get him to fold. So overall, I'm against using multiple bet sizes because it's really hard to balance your regular bet size and then your bigger bet size. But in this situation, having a 2x pot bet size is awesome because I feel like I can get him to fold a hand as strong as Queen 10. That's the top of his range here. And that's because aces and kings improve to a better two pair. And live players are just super nitty. He's not going to put 75% of his stack into the pot with a bad two pair here. And he just shows me a queen and folds. Again, this is another situation where nobody is seeing all the non-showdown winnings that I'm creating. I just muck my hand and scoop the pot. Nobody ever knows what's going on. Alright, since this is the last hand of the video, I'm filming an empty the clip video, and this is a check shove poker production. I felt that it could only be appropriate for me to show you the check shove of the week, and this is certainly that. So small blind folds, big blind limps, MP and hijack fold, and I ISO to 125 with king jack offsuit, button calls, and the big blind limp calls. So things that you need to know about the pre-flop dynamic: the button is a guy that's normally playing much bigger hold'em games, and it's late at night, and he's in our game because nothing bigger is going, and he's pretty much straddling every hand with no intention to fold, and he just wants action, and I was aware of that before I ISO'd with king jack here. So the flop comes ace king 6, ace king of hearts, big blind checks. I check because king jack isn't part of my bluffing range. It has too much showdown value, and at the same time it isn't part of my value betting range because it isn't strong enough to value bet. So I check, and I'm aware that the button is going to stab way too often here and fire a bunch of barrels at me, and I'm just going to have to deal with that. So button bets 175, big blind gets out of the way, and I have to check call at least one street with a king here. I check call. The turn is the 5 of hearts. I check again. The button bets 300 here, and I tank for, let's say, 15 seconds and check shove. Now, there are a bunch of things that you need to realize about this situation here. So first of all, the button is a very aggressive 3-better pre-flop, so he would have 3-bet aces, kings, and ace king and ace queen almost 100% of the time pre-flop. So what does that mean for me? That means that he doesn't have very many non-flush hands that he can call me with, because he can't even have ace queen with the queen of hearts here. And the other thing that we notice about this situation is, even if I assume that he's playing 100% of suited hands, the most combinations of flushes that he could have in this situation would be 36 here. The other thing that you notice is that I'm risking 1,700 to win 1,030, so I need my opponent to fold 62% of the time to make an instant profit if I have no equity when he calls. Okay, so if I take 36 combinations of flushes and just assume that he can have all of those, I really only need to come up with about 45 combinations of hands that I think I can get him to fold. And I can come up with that right away just by saying he's going to fold queen jack, jack 10, queen 10, and 10-9 that don't have 2 hearts in them. So if you go check that in Flopzilla, that's 52 combinations of hands that I think he would barrel with and then fold. So really the only thing that this comes down to is if I think he is capable of calling a check shove with one pair here. And for the most part, I don't think that my opponent is capable of doing that. Since this guy is really good, and he's going to realize that I'm going to take a flush draw and continue with my preflop initiative on the flop. He's probably going to realize that I don't have a ton of combinations of flushes in my range, but at the same time, whatever I'm check raising him with has to have a lot of equity against his hand, and because of that, I think that I can get him to fold a weak ace a decent amount of the time here. Definitely enough of the time that I can make an instant profit here, plus all of the times that I improve to a better hand with my extra equity that the Jack of Hearts gives me. So because of all of that, I check shove. The button shows me the ace of diamonds, mucks his hand, and I just muck mine and scoop the pot. And again, I kind of outplayed a player that is normally playing much bigger than me, and he just really wasn't aware of what my range looked like here, and I benefited from that. So that kind of wraps up the video, but there are a couple key points that I'd like to make sure you guys didn't miss. So in all three of these hands, my opponent ended up showing me top pair and then folding in a spot where I wasn't 100% sure that I could get him to fold the top of his range. So if you're a live poker player, I would definitely like to make sure that you notice that and caution you against showing cards. I basically never show a card unless it's a showdown, and it's really just because I don't want to give my opponent free information. People have to pay for that. So there are a lot of times where I'm playing way outside optimal, but because I'm in position, I'm either allowed to muck or my opponent ends up mucking, and nobody ever sees my hole cards, and it's just way easier for me to play outside of optimal because nobody's ever going to notice that and be able to take advantage of it. So don't show cards, especially in bigger games. And then the next thing I'd like you to notice is that these are all spots where my opponent's range was capped while my range was uncapped. So a lot of spots where you're either going to check shove all in or end up firing three barrels come down to your range being uncapped and your opponent's range being capped, and then you just kind of weigh the price that you're giving your opponent, the price that you're giving yourself, and kind of divide his range into hands that you think you can get him to fold and hands that you think he's calling with, and then you just go from there. So these plays don't work 100% of the time, but in all three of these examples, my play was working way more often than it needed to for me to break even, and that's why I'm showing you that. So again, it all starts pre-flop. You kind of figure out what he's doing pre-flop, figure out what the dynamic is, narrow his range down toward the end of the hand, and then you should have a pretty good idea of what you're dealing with. The more you punch these situations into Flopzilla, the better picture you're going to have in your mind when you're at the table in the situation before you decide to kind of pull the trigger and go for one of these bigger bluffs. So I hope you guys gained something from today's video. Again, this was a Check Shove Poker production. My name is Hunter Sitchy, and I hope that you guys run good, have fun, and constantly look for ways to improve.